The Government Accounting Office released a report yesterday that talked about the Highway Trust Fund. And what they noted over the last 4 years, that $78 billion of that trust fund has been spent on things other than highways, bridges, and roads. Some of the things it's been spent on, nobody would have any question. But here we find ourselves the second time in a year trying to bail out the trust fund, and we're going to get to decide whether we're going to steal it from our kids or steal it from the stimulus bill, which will actually make it much more stimulative than the money that's there. But we find ourselves in trouble. And if you ask yourself the question, when this trust fund was first set up, it was set up during the Eisenhower administration, and it was designed to build the interstate highway system and to help us with roads and bridges and secondary roads and bridges throughout the country. And what it has morphed into is that a large percentage of it now doesn't go for any of that. And so we find ourselves in the midst of a recession with last year having high gas prices, which depressed the money going into the fund, and with a recession now with decreasing the revenues going into the fund. And we have all these projects that we know are priority for us that need to be fixed. Now, the other thing we learned from this report is that 13,000 people in this country a year die because of bad roads, bad bridges, and bad highways. So it would seem to me that the Highway Trust Fund monies ought to be spent to eliminate those 13,000 deaths, and that the priority ought to be about roads, bridges, and highways. And I will put into the record many other items where the money is spent. 10% is mandated for highway beautification. Well, I think that's great if we don't have a trust fund that's broke, and we don't have 200,000 bridges in the country that are structurally have some defect, 93,000 which are seriously structurally defective. I think it's really important that we turn our attention to priorities that will support that. We're going to have a lot of votes on this today, and I'm supportive of us doing what we need to do for the trust fund. But I'm also supportive of us making sure that the priorities of that trust fund are about bridges, roads, and highways. In Oklahoma, in Tulsa, Oklahoma yesterday, we have a man in ICU because somebody hit a bridge with a car, but he was driving under the bridge in another lane, and chunks of concrete fell through the windshield and seriously injured him. Our highway department knew that we had a problem with that bridge, not in going over it or going under it, but if in fact the foundational principles for that bridge were at suspect, both in terms of the concrete that was underlying and the uprights that contain it. So the dollars that went to build a bicycle path, the dollars that went to plant flowers along the highway, the dollars that went to put walking paths, means that guy's in the hospital today because dollars didn't go for what they were intended for. And so when we have $78 billion over the last 4 years that don't go for roads, highways, and bridges, and instead go for things that aren't going to enhance the safety, aren't going to help the 13,000 lives a year be saved, America's got to ask, what are your priorities up here? So I'd like the unanimous consent to enter into the record the Government Accounting Office report on the Transportation Trust Fund.
Without an order.
And make the point that as they look at that, there are some important things for us to consider. We know, had we passed a better stimulus bill, we would be doing twice as much now as what we were doing in terms of fixing the real problems in this country in terms of transportation infrastructure. But we didn't. We passed a stimulus bill that what it did is it created transfer payments on 70% of it, and 20% of it may be considered to be stimulative. So the hope would be that as we go forward and we're going to bail this out, and what we really need to do ultimately is let us have our own money. From Oklahoma, we've never gotten 100% back. We've never gotten, I think, above this. My senior senator from Oklahoma, the highest was last year, but routinely when I first came to Congress, we were getting 74 cents out of every dollar that we sent. I assure you, we can keep that money. We can get a whole lot more done with it than what we get done through the trust fund now. And that may, in perchance, be one solution to ultimately get us out of this bind. I'd be happy to yield my senior.
Yeah, he's touching on the real problem that we have here, because I can remember up until about 5 years ago, our trust fund took care of our needs. The problem that we had was not just the fact that as it goes up, the proceeds go down, but that we got involved in things that had nothing to do with transportation. It used to be bridges and transportation and highways, and it was adequate at that time. You get all these hitchhikers saying, well, there's this big surplus, therefore let's tap into the surplus, and you have these things that have nothing to do with transportation. So the senator's right in his observations.
Will the senator yield for?
Yeah, let me make one other point. In the last 4 years, we built 25 transportation museums rather than build highways. Now think about that. Remember Minneapolis? Remember the bridge that collapsed? We're putting money into museums. I wonder if we're going to build a museum about the collapse of the bridge in Minneapolis. We're putting money into museums instead of money into making sure that the roads, bridges, especially the bridges, are safe in this country. And our priorities are messed up. The American people know our priorities are messed up. And hopefully, we can redirect transportation dollars to true transportation projects, not to the aesthetics that we right now, first of all, can't afford, even though they may be nice, and number two, are causing additional deaths on our highway every year. And I'd be happy to yield to the senator from Arizona.
We yield for a question.
I'd be happy to yield.
Couldn't it also be traced to earmarks and pork barrel, quote, demonstration projects? Could it not be traced to the fundamental facts that the 1982 highway bill included 10 demonstration projects totaling $386 million. The 87 highway bill, 152 pork barrel projects totaling $1.4 billion. The 1991 highway bill, 538 location-specific pork barrel projects totaling $6.1 billion. The 98 highway bill, 1,850 earmark projects totaling $9.3 billion. And then 2005, 5,634 earmark projects totaling $21.6 billion. How can anyone who calls themselves a fiscal conservative stand by and allow this kind of thing to happen? And what happens? $2.3 billion for landscaping enhancements along, of all places, the Ronald Reagan Freeway. $480,000 to rehabilitate a historic warehouse along the Erie Canal. $600,000 for the construction of horse riding trails in Virginia. $2.5 million for the Daniel Boone Wilderness Trail Corridor. $400,000 to rehabilitate and redesign the Erie Canal Museum, and $400,000 for jogging, bicycle, and trolley trail in Columbus, Georgia. How in the world can those things be justified and expect our constituents not to rise up in horror?
Well, to answer the senator's question, they can't. And there's no question there are certain priorities. What has happened is as we try to address priorities for individual states, because the states don't get their money back, there may be a great project in there, and along comes a lousy one. So I would just make the point is we've got our eye off the ball. And the eye needs to go back. And all you have to do is go to the Tulsa World to see the story that happened yesterday in Senator Inhofe's own home state. And had we been applying money to transportation instead of non-transportation through this trust fund, that gentleman probably wouldn't be in the hospital today. A 600 or 700 pound piece of concrete fell through the windshield, trapping him in his car. So we have real problems. We don't have just a problem of not enough money in the trust fund. Our problem is the money that goes out doesn't go for the real things that the trust fund was designed to do in the first place. So I would just restate, and then I'll yield back. We got to do one of two things. Until this country gets out of the financial jam it's in, The first thing we got to do is make sure money's spent on a real transportation project to save some of those 13,000 lives that the Transportation Department says are occurring directly because we're not fixing roads, bridges, and highways. That's number one. Or number two, let's eliminate the thing and let all the states keep their money at home. We'll figure out how to do it better in Oklahoma because we've never gotten a square deal on this deal yet. And with that, I yield back.
Could I,
Senator from Arizona is recognized.
would you yield for a question?
I'd be happy to.
How much, does the gentleman know how much we are spending on highway and transportations, I use quotation, projects in the stimulus, the $787 billion stimulus bill?
I believe it was 4 or 5%. Maybe Senator Inhofe will know that answer.
Yes, if you allow me to answer the question, it's 3.5%. An additional 3.5% in military construction, so a total really of about 7.5% of any kind of stimulus, in my opinion.
And how much of that does the distinguished ranking member know? How much of that has been spent? How much
yes,
that is in dollars, and how much?
Everything except 67% has not been, what's the word there? Has not been obligated. So 33% is obligated.
I thank you.
Let me add also, if you go to governmentspending.gov and you go to recovery.gov, you will find, as of last week, I don't know what it is this week, that only $78 billion of the whole stimulus package has actually been spent. Now, some more of it's been obligated, but actually been spent. And so I think there's another $150 billion that's been obligated out of that. That's one of the reasons that we're not seeing the effect of the stimulus. One is it's not going to really stimulate things, and number two is it's not getting out there to where we need to get it out.
Well, I'm not sure who has the floor, but if it's you yield to this. That's another reason that the Vitter Amendment and the Ensign Amendment are good, because you're talking about money that is out there that it's not recoverable. So let's try to direct it someplace where we can get something from. I had an amendment during the consideration of the stimulus bill, and to try to triple the amount of money that would go into actual construction, and they wouldn't take it up.
Thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, as Senator Coburn has just mentioned, we released a report today examining how the Highway Trust Fund receipts have been used for projects other than road and bridge construction and maintenance over the past 5 years, and it relies heavily on the new Government Accountability Office analyses that was performed at our request on how we prioritize or how we fail to prioritize our nation's transportation spending. And again, I'd like to remind my colleagues that the GAO concluded that over the last 5 years alone, we spent $78 billion on projects other than road and bridge construction and maintenance. Let me repeat, $78 billion on projects other than the construction and maintenance of roads and bridges. And where did it go? According to the GAO, over $2 billion was spent on 5,547 projects for bike paths and pedestrian walkways. Bike paths and pedestrian walkways. As one example, we identified an $878,000 project for a pedestrian and bicycle bridge for a Minnesota town of 847 people. Now, I don't know what that works out to be, but just roughly, I think it works out to about $1,000 per person. You know, I'd be interested to know how many inhabitants actually use that bridge. And we all know about the bridge to nowhere. Perhaps this is the bridge for no one. Another $850 million went for 2,772, quote, scenic beautification and landscaping projects around the country. $84 million was spent on roadkill prevention, wildlife habitat connectivity, and highway runoff pollution mitigation projects. Another $84 million went to 398 pedestrian and bicyclist safety projects. Now, I don't mean to diminish safety, but do we really need to spend federal dollars for brochures like the one we cited in our report that encourage bicyclists to, quote, make eye contact, smile, or wave to communicate with motorists. Courtesy and predictability are a key to safe cycling. Another $28 million went to the transportation museums, and $215 million went to scenic or historic highway programs, and the list goes on. You know, I know that Americans find these numbers disturbing as I do. They should, because they demonstrate that Congress is not focused on our nation's transportation priorities. We should not forget that 2 years ago, the 35 West Bridge over the Mississippi River collapsed during rush hour, killing 13 and injuring 123 more of our fellow citizens. That tragedy exposed a nationwide problem of deficient bridges. According to the Department of Transportation, in 2008, of the nation's 601,396 bridges, 151,394, or 25%, of our bridges are deficient. Over 71,000 of them had significant deterioration and reduced load carrying capability, and almost 80,000 didn't meet current design standards. So we've been spending billions of dollars on bike paths, museums, landscaping, and roadkill reduction programs. Part and parcel of the problem, obviously, is the addiction to earmarks. As I mentioned before, the way that the earmarks have grown. One of the standard arguments made by the earmarkers and pork barrelers in Congress is, it's always been like this. It's always been like this. We've always had congressional discretion because we know better than the bureaucrats do where the taxpayers' money should go. Frankly, I agree with sometimes that's the case if it competes with other programs, if it is scrutinized and authorized by the appropriate committees. But what we do is that we earmark these pork barrel projects, and many times, let's have a little straight talk, Mr. President, they are in return for campaign contributions, and we see corruption. People are under investigation. Lobbyist offices are being raided by the FBI. And again, I'm not going to repeat what I said to the senator from Oklahoma, but the 1982 highway bill had 10, count them, 10 demonstration projects, and it was $386 million. In 87, $1.4 billion. 91, $6.1 billion. 98, we get up to 1,850, totaling $9.3 billion. And 2005, 5,634 earmarked projects, totaling $21.6 billion of American taxpayers' dollars. And that's where you find the bike paths and the beautification projects and the trails and all of those that are earmarked by specific members of Congress, and meanwhile, we have 25% of our bridges that are deficient, and 71,000 of them have significant deterioration and reduced load-carrying capability, and 80,000 that don't meet current design standards. What are we going to say to the taxpayers of America if, God forbid, and I pray not, that there's another bridge collapse? What do we say to them? That we took their tax dollars and built a museum instead of fixing their bridges and highways to ensure their safety? Well, maybe, just maybe, if we hadn't spent $21.6 billion on earmark project, maybe that some of that money, just maybe, some of that money might have gone to fix the design problems on the bridge over the Mississippi. Maybe not. Maybe we didn't know. I'm not making a judgment here. But it seems to me that sooner or later, If you earmark as much as $21.6 billion of the taxpayers' money to museums and bike paths and brochures, that sooner or later, the priority projects suffer. Now, again, projects originally authorized under Safety Lou, the 2005 highway bill, included $2.32 billion for landscaping enhancements along the Ronald Reagan Freeway. You know, I've often wondered how often Ronald Reagan turns over in his grave. I bet he was spinning on that one. $480,000 to rehabilitate a historic warehouse along the Erie Canal. $600,000 for the construction of horse riding trails in Virginia. You'll notice that all of these projects are earmarked to a specific locality. That's what they, among other things, they have in common. $2.5 million for the Daniel Boone Wilderness Trail Corridor. $400,000 to rehabilitate and redesign the Erie Canal Museum. $400,000 for jogging, bicycle, and trolley trail in Columbus, Georgia, and the list goes on and on. And no one thinks our nation should be without flowers and ferries and bike paths and boat museums. But today we've got to make some choices about priorities and how we spend limited resources. This has to be considered in the backdrop of this year a $1.8 trillion deficit, the largest in the history of this country since World War II. And there's no end in sight. It's almost overwhelming, a $1.8 trillion deficit this year. But what's worse, it's no way out. No one knows of a plan to bring us to a balanced budget without fundamental reform of Medicare and Social Security. And here before us on health care reform, we see another $1 trillion piled on that. When are we going to decide that we cannot afford taxpayers' dollars to rehabilitate and redesign museums, for trails, for beautification and landscaping enhancements, when we have other priorities on transportation that has to do with the safety of our citizens? I want to thank the senator from Oklahoma for continued advocacy for the taxpayers of America. I want to thank him for all of the efforts he makes, and I regret that neither he nor I will be elected Miss Congeniality in the United States Senate again this year. But I also believe that the American people are beginning to wake up, and they're beginning to get angry. We saw this in the tea parties that took place all over this country. I hear it and see it in response to my Twitters. Over 1 million people now follow my Twitters and my tweets. And they are very interested in this. And we're going to post all of these. We're going to let the American people know where their dollars have done. So I urge my colleagues, let's for once catch up with the American people and start becoming fiscally conservative. And one of the best ways we can be careful stewards of their tax dollars is to make sure that we place as our highest priority their safety as they travel the highways and cross the bridges of the United States of America. Mr. President, I yield the floor.